Good afternoon and welcome to the third and final event discussion in this The What Works Festival of Learning series. My name is Anya Kerr, an entrepreneur and broadcaster. It's my pleasure to be your host for the next hour. This entire conversation this week started on Monday with a conversation about partners in prevention. Yesterday we talked about partners in policy. Today we're going to talk about partners in practice. And you're going to see with our four speakers today very much an effort to bring the theory, the concepts into the reality, connecting the whys to the hows, and really hopefully inspire all of you with their collective work out in the field day to day, and also leave you hopefully with just some practical ideas and insights that you can take back to your teams this afternoon and the days and months to come. And we do want to leave you all with a challenge between now and 1 o'clock of leaving you with just one thing. And I want you to literally write that down. Like, what is the one thing you're going to take away at 1 o'clock as a to-do? Someone might leave you with words of inspiration or a mantra. Somebody might give you ideas on how to pitch for funding. Others might give you a case study that you're going to go off and read about. But I want all of you listening and watching today of just one thing. What is the one thing you're going to take at 1 o'clock from this? This entire conversation and series and the community building that has happened here this week is part of 3 years of work as part of this What Works Festival of Learning, where it really has become a space for sharing knowledge and ideas, discussing the best practices in early intervention and prevention, but also just creating a space for you as professionals that can continue on your learning journey and stay curious. This entire initiative has been made possible by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, funded through dormant accounts. In all of that, we really do want questions from you, our audience, throughout the next hour. If you just go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, we'd love to see your comments, your feedback, but critically your questions to each of the speakers. Do just let me know in the questions who it is primarily addressed to, and we'll be watching for those questions throughout the conversation and ensuring that we have at least 10-15 minutes at the end to hear from you, the audience. So please do keep that Q&A function busy as we go. Just finally, before we get started, we'd love to draw attention to this event, to all of our speakers and social media, using the hashtag Partners in Prevention. Please do tag the What Works Twitter handle, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc., and the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, so we can draw attention to everybody's good collective work. Now, with all of that, you're going to see here in the room beside me, I'm joined by three speakers who are Niamh Dowler of Laois Offaly Children and Young People Services Committee. We have Eileen Smith from the Hill Street Family Resource Centre. On screen, you're going to see Kevin Webster, not Kevin Webster, but Padraig Fitzgerald from Rethink Ireland. Hello to Padraig. And here in the room, we also have Kevin Webster, who's the Senior Manager, Prevention Partnership and Family Support from TUSLA. And I'm going to go to you first, Kevin. But to tell you a little bit about Kevin's background, Kevin is a qualified social worker with 40 years practice experience across the community, voluntary and primarily the statutory sector in Ireland. Also worked for a couple of years in the UK. Since 2013, Kevin has worked as a principal social worker with the HSE Children and Families and then TUSLA Children and Family Agency. Since 2014, he has been the senior, and I'm going to give you the breakdown of PPFS, since we might mention it a few times today, which is Prevention, Partnership and Family Support in Dublin South East and Wicklow. And in this role, Kevin is a member of the local area social work management team delivering TUSLA's social work, child protection and welfare service and family support services. And there's much more beyond that Kevin has been involved in, including the website changingfutures.ie. But maybe first to come to that theme, Kevin, of collaboration, which has been a theme throughout this week when we've talked about prevention, when we've talked about policy. Can you talk about that role you play between being that honest broker, being that bridge between agencies and services and departments?
Okay. Thanks, Anya. So I suppose part of my role would be to I would see part of my role as trying to integrate services, so both within the social work department, but also externally with our funded services. And I thought I'd give you an example of that to sort of try and bring it to life around domestic violence and abuse work. So during COVID, Ciara Murphy, who's the duty principal social worker, would have found that we had a 70% increase in domestic violence referrals. And also the profile of children on our child protection system changed. So traditionally that would be most often children who've experienced long-term neglect. But what Kira has started to notice is much more of those children being listed now are for emotional abuse because of domestic abuse. So we saw a huge change, particularly during COVID. So I suppose what we try and do within, and I'm going to say PPFS if that's okay, because it's shorter. So what we try and do is work with our colleagues within the social work department. I would cover sort of family support services and MEHL, which is our sort of main sort of early intervention framework. But in this particular case, I suppose we realised that there were, we needed to develop responses to domestic abuse within the department. So I'm just going to talk about 3 different things we did. So the first thing is that I would have had some experience previously trying to develop an internal domestic violence support worker in Tala, and we work with that area still to try and collaborate on that. So we worked together on developing this role internally. So just last year we developed or started, one of the family support practitioners was reassigned, Lucy was reassigned as a domestic violence and abuse worker. So that means our social work teams have somebody internally who they can speak to get advice, but they can also flag and direct women towards Lucy to get that direct support. We then have to work obviously with the external domestic violence services as well, so that's the sort of external collaboration. And what I've found, I suppose, over the years is that where you have somebody like that who builds that expertise, social workers feel more comfortable in dealing with those issues and feel they have somebody they can speak to. The other thing we've done is, and we're trying to have a holistic response, is around responding to children's needs. Historically, I think children have only received services around domestic abuse through their mother, often, and there are programs trying to develop services directly for children. So there's a program called TLC Kids, which because we have good working relationships, I suppose, within PPFS, we're able to negotiate with our own domestic sexual gender-based violence unit within TUSLA to provide funding for Barnardo's to employ a coordinator. So we're just beginning to develop these programs for children. And then finally, we're looking at, I suppose, historically, social work hasn't really worked with the perpetrators in domestic violence, and we generally talk about men. Mostly it's men who are perpetrating domestic abuse. So we're trying to develop and we are developing a sort of an internal one-to-one response, so that social work teams, if they're working with a domestic abuse case, they can offer the man to have an intervention with one of our staff. So we're working with Move and Mend to try and develop that service. So Ross, Paul and Neil are 3 social workers on the team, and they're beginning to offer this service. We did have somebody who retired who did it before, and these 3 workers are now doing that. So try and give you a sense of how we're working internally and externally. I hope that sort of illustrates it.
And everyone will be familiar, unfortunately, with just the staggering statistics surrounding domestic violence. You look at the 2021 annual report from Women's Aid, 33,000 disclosures of domestic violence and abuse. Like, this is unfortunately a real pervasive, harrowing reality for so many people now, and something like in excess of 5,000 instances of child abuse. Given we had a pandemic, we know the causal effects there. Are your team, is this system able to respond to that need? It sounds like you've been able to build these collaborations and shift resources around, but I assume there's a whole upskilling, there's new collaborations have to be built, because unfortunately this is probably our future reality. Actually,
I spoke to Stephanie Holt, who'd be a bit of an expert in Trinity around the pandemic, and they did some research around the domestic abuse rates during COVID, and what they'd found was that it isn't actually the frequency that's increased, it's the severity. So there was always this much domestic abuse, but it became more severe and therefore was reported into Child Protection and Welfare Services. So we're seeing an increase in the severity, I think. And what was most interesting, it was always there and we just didn't see it necessarily. The other piece I suppose we're trying to do is develop our social work response. So having all these different pathways is really important for the victim survivor, for the children, for the perpetrator, but also to try and develop social work responses. And I think within PPFS, because we have that early intervention focus, we can try and look at trying to develop look at that bigger picture and try and develop services. And we are doing that. Tusta has set up a national working group, which my area manager Joanne Cullen is chairing, and we're trying to look at good social work practice to respond to domestic violence.
And in that you talked about good practices, good processes. So what is at the heart, in order to make collaborations in domestic violence, it's just one area, but what is at the heart from terms of good process when it comes to hub managers and the likes that you've learned actually works well for these complex, nuanced issues?
Well, would you want me to give a different example than domestic violence? Will I, or
yeah,
just
or you can go to the example of the hub manager.
Yes, okay, yeah. So this was another example we spoke about in terms of how we try to build collaboration internally and externally. So when PPFS was set up in 2014, people would probably know that was trying to roll out MEHL, and we set up child and family support networks in each area. And in order to do that, we set up what we called a hub managers group, and that would be all the funded managers of our funded services, because we were trying to create a hub at the centre of each network, so that families had an actual door to walk into to get help. And so it started off as that sort of implementation group, but over time it has developed into much more of I suppose, a good practice group. So we, for example, in 2019 went down for a day to John Canavan in NUIG and talked about what does good family support look like, what sort of model does, what constitutes good family support. So we have a set of principles now in terms of what we think it looks like. We've looked at outcome frameworks and trying to improve that. And we, I suppose, the more recent thing we've tried to do is we're trying to set up a reflective practice group, so that hub managers very often might work in quite small organisations and are a little bit isolated, so that we're trying to create a bit of more of a peer support, which will support those managers, but also drive good standards and good practice and good collaboration.
Okay, it sounds really important that you have that, obviously, peer-to-peer support in these very highly complex emotive areas. And speaking of which, one of the other areas that we've unfortunately see starting to come into our headlines is this whole area of child and parent violence, CPV. Can you talk a little bit about the approach there, where you're trying to kind of cover a multitude of different behaviours, anger, aggression, physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, damage to property, school refusal, like it's so complex, it's so broad, and how you're finding ways now, we've talked a lot this week in all of the conversations about parental supports, empowering parents, and just what is the approach there for that particular issue? Okay,
well, I won't pretend to be an expert on that, but we do have an expert in the area. We have a woman called Tara Kelly, who's a Springboard manager in Loughlinstown, and I suppose about when I started to work with Tara 9 years ago, she started to talk to me about this as an emerging issue, child-to-parent violence, something that she was noticing in her work. So through supervision, we started to look at how we might be able to respond to that. And, I suppose it was very prophetic in the sense that now we would get a huge amount of referrals into our duty system, which actually aren't child protection, but are around child-to-parent violence. And I suppose the understanding around that is that it's maybe an issue of parental authority. So there's a non-violent resistance program has been developed, and Tara would have been at the forefront of bringing that to the area and beyond. So we started to develop training, and herself and a former colleague of hers who unfortunately died during COVID, herself and Katrina would have rolled out a lot of training. And so in our area, I suppose we're a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of having a champion like Tara. But just to give an example again, I guess, of collaboration, another of my managers, Grace Birmingham, a family support coordinator in Wicklow, along with her colleague Anna Joyce, started to set up a network. So in conversation with Tara, we thought we can't do all this. We can't do, one person can't do it all. So we need to try and develop, again, a more collaborative interagency response. So in Wicklow, what's been really successful is that Grace and Anna have, and during COVID it was online, and continues to be online, but they have regular peer support meetings where in Wicklow, all the different agencies that have been trained in NVR come together and they coordinate referrals into groups, and they coordinate who's going to facilitate those groups. And it's been very successful in the sense that Grace and Tara have been asked to speak regularly now around how that network developed, because without those sort of champions, without that collaborative interagency group, if it all falls on one agency, it's very hard to keep running programs and to coordinate where they are in the county and so on. So there's a real coordination piece, and it's been very successful.
Lots of great examples in there. For those of you listening, watching, if you have questions for Kevin on all of that, do keep them coming in through the Q&A function. We'll be watching out for them. We will have opportunities to ask Kevin lots of questions about that as we come towards the end. I'm going to move now to Niamh Dowler, Coordinator, Laois Offaly Children and Young People Services. Earlier this year, Laois Offaly CYPSE was awarded funding under the What Works Sharing Knowledge Fund for the Consent, Education and Healthy Relationships project, working with Tullamore Rape Crisis Centre. And obviously, this comes at a moment where I think it's fair to say there's a lot of initiatives, a lot of projects here and abroad to really now get to grips with consent and moving beyond just teaching no means no, but getting more into what consent looks like, feels and sounds like, that we're really getting into the nuances and really thinking about the sexual literacy and confidence for young people and adults in all of this. But Niamh, what I wanted to ask you was, in the context of all of that and this important conversation we've all started to have around consent and how you teach consent, can you talk a little bit about the process? I know there's like 8 C's that you have been working on, but maybe just to kind of set the context of this project. Why this project? Why now?
Sure, Anya. Just firstly, I suppose, as you said, this project just kicked off this summer, so we've been meeting ever since we got the What Works funding. In July and then August, everybody was trying to frantically meet because, you know, it is a short time span initially for us, but obviously we've big plans. So just to say, I represent a working group of 7 partners in true collaboration style. And these are people from Tusla Midlands, from Offaly Domestic Violence Support Service, Laois Domestic Abuse Service, Tullamore Rape Crisis that you've mentioned, the Sexual Assault Treatment Unit in Midlands Mullingar, the Sexual Health Clinic in Portlaoise, and the Garda DPSU unit in Laois Offaly. So that's our collaborative group of partners, and it's just obviously just want to acknowledge then that I just represent them today, that I'm just one cog in the wheel, as I would like to call it. So I suppose this particular project, the context for it lies back in, it was actually one of the Gardaí that met with me back a long time ago, and other service user or services were saying as well that they were seeing a huge amount of intergenerational unhealthy relationships coming back through their services, and obviously, as you've mentioned, all the stats for other services in DSGVB increasing over the last few years. So there was a real local identified need in terms of we need to get to these young people, we need to support them, and all this work has been done in an empowerment and supportive capacity for the young people and their families. So obviously the context is very important for us to look at the policy context, and obviously if we looked at Minister McEntie's zero tolerance policy, I think that came out there in June, that was quite a good baseline for us to work off and to be supported by in terms of what we're trying to achieve here. And then in the schools context, it's the Department of Education SPHE curriculum, the RISE Pact that's related to relationships and sexuality. So that was kind of the policy or what was out there. There's lots more. I mean, there's incredible amount of resources in this area. But I suppose what we're trying to do is something very niche. And I know Kevin mentioned around pathways. We're also trying to signpost to local services through this particular project. And then also in the context, we also needed to look at the practice. So what was out there, what was good practice? So obviously we followed the incredible work that was done with the Manuela programme, which is now the Consent Ed programme under DSGVB in Tusla. So that was kind of the context piece for us, Anya. And then very quickly we had to move on to where was their commitment.
And so building on that, right, so you have your context, your landscape, commitment seems to be there. You've mentioned the Minister for Justice, Helen McEntee, so there's definitely will. You then start to kind of look at more questions of, I guess, capacity, the challenge, and you have your champions, so we all need allies in order to kind of make sure this is prioritised. But can you talk a little bit, as you worked through all of that, then to the challenges that the project had to confront as part of getting this up and running?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the challenges also came through, I suppose, the whole capacity of who was available. I mean, it's all very well saying, yes, we will engage and we will be a partner on this project. But we must remember that all the people we were looking towards are frontline, extremely busy people with increasing workloads. So I guess one good sign for me at the early stages was that when we were putting together the application form, and everybody listening in today will know what we all do in that frantic space of trying to get application forms in. But I was ringing around people, I was sending them the draft, they were coming back with good stats, good data, so I knew there was a huge appetite for us to drive this on. So certainly then in terms of the challenges, because of the project that we looked at, consent and healthy relationships, we had different perspectives. Even though we all wanted the same thing and we all know what the law is, there would be slightly different perspectives in terms of approach to topics. So we spent a lot of really, really interesting meetings working through all of this, and even a very practical thing in terms of a challenge when we were designing these 5 workshops, what workshop would go first and which workshop would go last, to the point that the one that we thought that was going to be last at the first meeting is now first after a series of maybe 4 or 5 meetings. But that's through, I suppose, gelling through the group and working things through and getting a sense of what's in each different workshop. So that was really good. I'm glad to tell you, Anya, that on this occasion, money was not a challenge. On this occasion, because I suppose everybody's coming from, Eileen is nodding here beside me, and I'm sure there's lots of people on the call or on the call today nodding. But I have to say the What Works Sharing Knowledge Fund has just been, it does exactly what it says on the tin. And when I sit there in the meetings, I just go, yeah, this is it, sharing knowledge, because the level of expertise across the partners that I've mentioned and the willingness to share and for us to upskill us all before we ever put ourselves out in that public platform to the schools is just incredible.
It's great. I'm curious to learn, as you say, you can have all of these stakeholders and everybody, there's that mantra that everybody should have strong opinions but loosely held, so that you can come out of the room and, somebody has to make a decision, you have to rank, you have to prioritise that these are the workshops in this order that we're going to do. How did you bring all of that then knowledge to the point where it did get to collaboration, but critically then coordination, that there is something now that is working? So I'm curious in just that flow and just any early insights as to what is working given the extent of this great coordination.
Sure. I suppose the continuity piece and spending the time listening to each other and working through our consistency of messaging and why we needed it to be so consistent given the sensitivity of the topic. So, and then we had some people who delivered in schools already, so that was a little bit, they'd kind of go back and redo some of their material to fit into the wider 5-part workshops for the schools. I guess the collaboration was really important, that we looked out to Galway Rape Crisis Centre, who have huge experience, and we used our local partner, Tullamore Rape Crisis Centre, to kind of make sure that happened. So the collaboration then was to bring in that external resource to work with us, but we had to have our groundwork done and we had to have gelled, and we had to, it would have been fruitless had we brought Galway Rape Crisis Centre in any sooner, but we were so glad of their experience. So in terms of someone to collaborate with. And then we also, in terms of practicalities around dealing with disclosures, because everyone has different policies. So we were delighted to link up with our Midlands TUSLA Children's First Information and Advice person, and they were able to work with that piece on us. So I think this is a thing, there's so many incredible people out there all across this sector, and it's just kind of tapping into each other and trying to find the time. But yeah, money does help sometimes.
Great. Very glad to hear it. It sounds like a great playbook that we could all learn from for many other examples. Do keep questions coming so that you have questions for Niamh on all of the particulars of that. You can go to the Q&A function. I'll be keeping an eye out for those. Next up is Eileen Smith, and Eileen is the project manager with the Hill Street Family Resource Centre. Hill Street Family Resource Centre is an intercultural centre for families and children based in Dublin's north east inner city. Hill Street was awarded funding under the What Works Learning Together Fund to develop and implement the preparation for preschool programme aimed at organisations interested in delivering the programme. And I think I saw a lovely photo of some of your colleagues with the President of Ireland recently out at a lovely garden party paying tribute to all of your great work, Eiling. Really well done on that. But maybe just to step back, just tell us more about Hill Street, what it is, how it came about.
Okay, thank you very much, Anya. Hill Street Family Resource Centre is, as you said, it's an intercultural family resource centre because of where it's based in Dublin's northeast inner city. We're based in an area that has a high population of migrants. In total, in the northeast inner city, there are between 50 and 60% of migrants, but in our direct area, it's probably around 80% of ethnic minority families and individuals. It's an area with pockets of high deprivation, so there's also areas where there's plenty of money, but there are areas of high deprivation. Many of our families that come to Hill Street would work in low-paid jobs, be paying high private rental costs, and would have very low disposable income. They're also first-time parents. So they come to Hill Street without other family support. So they're not like me, who grew up with 6 brothers and sisters. They all live in Dublin. They all supported me when I had my children. They're very isolated and alone. And I suppose the first step in Hill Street is the welcome. Our ethos is that we are an open door. We're a universal service, or universal. I actually don't like the word service because I think service means there's a recipient, whereas the way we work is in partnership. Yeah, thank you.
I think building on Kevin and Neve's themes, the beauty of this is the collaboration as well. You know, be it between your after-school clubs, your parent and child groups. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, we sometimes use that phrase of, you know, it takes a village, but I think that's really true of what you do in Hill Street.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of words that have been mentioned. Integrated. Hill Street works from an integrated approach. We link with all of the other organisations in the northeast inner city that work in our area. Our work focuses on the parents having a voice from the moment they enter into Hill Street. So our programmes are in direct response to their needs. We're a community development organisation. We work from community development principles. Partnership is one of the highest, I suppose, or one of the ones that we focus a lot on. And it's in response to our parents' needs that we develop programmes, and the preparation for preschool is one of those programmes.
So tell us more about that, like who it is aimed at and what you're hoping this particular project. It's for 1 year and 9 months to 3 years. So yeah, talk a little bit about the why and what you hope it's going to be able to do in the community.
Okay, the programme is about 10 or 11 years old. It has evolved throughout the years. It was a programme that parents identified within the centre because they saw that when their children were starting preschool, they didn't have language skills because they spoke their mother tongue at home, but were going to preschool and didn't have language skills. They also had strong separation anxiety because they didn't have those social networks or weren't connected with other family members. So the programme started as a language support, and it was a once-a-week programme where parents and children come in September and it finishes in June, and they were coming for once a week. And we focused, the child and family workers focused on language development and slowly separating parents and children. And then the parents went home for an hour and a half, did generally cleaning or shopping, didn't really do anything mindful for themselves. So over the years, that has developed into a programme where parents then said that they wanted their own programme and also that they felt the children needed additional sessions. So it's now a twice-weekly programme that runs in Hill Street. The parents and children start together, or caregivers and children, or grandparents and children start together. There's a slow separation between September and December. And come January, there's full separation. The children are in a room, like a preschool room. They are following the Astra curriculum. And the parents are downstairs with a development worker, and they are identifying their needs. And generally, I suppose the benefits of the programme. So we did a piece of research because we saw the benefits and we felt that the programme should be rolled out nationally. So we did some research in collaboration with DCU, with Matthias Urban, who's the head of the Early Childhood Research Centre. And he had a very similar ethos to ours around diversity and inclusion and community involvement in children in early years education. And we developed the research, we got the evidence, because without evidence you can't get funding. So we have to have documented evidence. We had our own evidence, but we need to document evidence. The evidence, I suppose, showed the benefits for the children in that because we worked with preschool, that was another collaborative piece of action research with parents, with preschools, with the university and with the staff in Hill Street. And the benefits for the children were very clear. They settled in quicker.
Great.
They were more confident. Their language skills. It's not that they had fluency in English, but they understood English. They understood routines and transitions. The benefits for the parents were life-changing for some. We have 3 parents on our board of management who came through the programme. One is the chairperson of Hill Street. We have a parents forum that was initiated from past and current parents in the programme. We have 7 cultural ambassadors who've come from Hill Street who are in the community. So not only are the benefits for the organisation, but the benefits are for the wider community.
You have ambassadors who come through it.
Yeah.
And presumably with all of the benefits you talk about there, the holistic self, the greater confidence, but the settling in longer, or quicker rather, I presume over time what you will see with these kids who came through that is that maybe their attendance rates are going to be high because they had that good start into the school system. Hopefully over time that's what you'll be able to see.
And I think as well, Anya, what we see is that parents are participating in schools. And I think it's another thing that was spoken about was parental involvement. I mean, there's a whole strategy around parental engagement. And one of the organisations that's currently rolling out, they keep saying this is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
We're engaging parents in early years education, first of all, but then those parents are going to go on. We have 7 parents who sit on the local school board association, and I believe it's because they found a voice.
They were invested early in it and taken seriously in their feedback heard. Given that it was a no-brainer, what about funding then? Is that hard? You know, we heard earlier from Niamh, in her case, funding came through. Is this something can be hard to get funding for? How did the What Works funding compare to maybe other routes that you've taken in the past?
I think, again, Hill Street is a very small organisation. It's our 7 staff in Hill Street. We compete all the time against bigger organisations that have more resources in terms of developing funding strategies and funding plans. For us to get to where we are now, we've had 4 funders. The first ones were the Catherine Howard Foundation and the Community Integration Fund. That was for the piece of research. So then we had the evidence. Then we went to What Works, to the Learning Together Fund, and we got the funding to design an implementation manual. So basically we have a manual now on how to roll out the preparation for preschool and other organisations. The collaborative piece of that was that we mentored. The funding from What Works allowed us to mentor 2 other organisations in Hill Street so that they could then go on to roll out, and they input into the manual. The manual is an online version because we see through the community development ethos, I suppose, our approach that everything has to be able to evolve. It can't be static. So that manual can change. And now we have funding through the RTE Toy Show Appeal to roll out the programme and to run a training programme on it. That's all really positive and really good, but each funding stream is for 1 year.
Yeah.
I think if I was a funder, I would have looked at our research, I would have seen it was a no-brainer, and I would have funded it to now, so that we didn't have to spend the amount of time and resources that we have, the limited time and resources we have on seeking funding.
Year on year, and this is probably a good segue, so thank you for teeing Padraig up nicely, because this comes up all the time of getting, like, the funding is welcome, but if it's coming only in those short bursts of a year, then you're always in fundraising mode and you're not getting to do the future proofing and the 3 and 5 year strategies. So Padraig, this is a good point to be bringing you in. And Padraig Fitzgerald is a fund manager at Rethink Ireland. He previously worked as the international programs manager for the Hope Foundation and oversaw the NGO's projects in India. As part of his work with the Hope Foundation, Padraig was awarded by the Europe India Centre for Business and Industry as being one of the top 40 under under 40 leaders promoting EU-Indian relations. Maybe we'll just actually start there, Padraig, just on that issue. Like Rethink Ireland, you guys are always looking at social impact and trying to find ways maybe to match. Could be government funds, could be what WhatWorks is doing. But is that one of the blockers here? Like Rethink Ireland is always trying to think of the world of 2030 and beyond. But people like Eileen, Niamh, Kevin are often dealing with funds that are just for the calendar year. So is that something that Rethink Ireland is trying to address? And what have you seen so far as being one of the barriers there?
It is, Anya, and I suppose, look, to go into it, what I might do is just give an overview for those who aren't aware of Rethink's model of funding as well. So like we would see ourselves as being somewhat different. So what we are is we're a venture philanthropy organisation, and we provide not just cash grants. So, cash and money funding is one big thing. But our biggest input that we try and provide to projects and organizations is our business supports. That's our consultancy supports that we provide with them. So the way that we try and do it then is just making sure that, like, look, if we are investing in projects and if it is for a short case of time, and, through WhatWorks initiative, we developed the Children and Youth Digital Solutions Fund last year. It was a €600,000 fund. It supported 9 organizations, but it was only for 1 year. And I suppose I do see a difference when we fund a 3-year funding for projects versus 1 year. But what we do within that 1 year is we make sure that projects, not just they receive the money and the cash injection, but they receive consultancy supports from us to be able to develop these strategies. It's quite intensive, but like each of the projects that came off of that fund last year, they all received a full strategic plan, a theory of change. They received training in terms of communications, articulating their value proposition for further funding. And some of the projects, based on their needs, were able to develop funding strategies, funding income generation plans as well. So that, look, the fund unfortunately was only for 1 year, but we were able to develop these other assets to make sure that when we're putting them off, we're bringing them, with assets that they can look for extra funding. I suppose what we try and do as a whole, though, is we also develop funds in a portfolio setting. So it's not just a case that we're funding ad hoc projects here and there. We develop funds with a specific theme. So, like Digital Solutions, which was funded through WhatWorks, that was specifically around helping organizations transition from in-person services for young people to an online or digital offering. So, like we've done other, which are specific mental health focused funds, equality focused funds, youth education funds. And when we develop funds in a portfolio and when we bring projects in a portfolio as well, it allows peer support, peer learning, peer mentorship. It also allows us to kind of look at those organizations and the sector more broadly, see where we can open our networks as well, because that's one big thing that we do have. As you said, like we've other corporate funders, we've access to corporate funders. So we're trying to match up organizations with that potential funding as well. Even with the consultancy supports as well, what we're doing, our consultants would have worked across numerous different projects, different funds, and they have, they have a knowledge of other organizations that say, Project A mightn't be aware that Project C is operating within the same space. One project could be up in Connemara, one could be down here in Waterford, and it's putting that collaboration in place so that they can see, is there an opportunity for them to collaborate, to support, or to co-develop, or, a potential funding pitch as well.
Yeah, it's really smart doing that little bit of matchmaking, so it avoids the duplication, but then you have people coming into a space and sharing the problems, but also the opportunities and solutions. When you look at all of those different types of fundings, and you guys are kind of like the honest brokers in the middle and trying to do the matching funding and just play matchmaking with partners, do you think different types of funds can achieve different things? Philanthropic funding maybe can achieve something different to government funding versus private funding. And is there different risks associated with it, if you're a recipient? So how, as people are sometimes maybe looking at those different types of funds, can they do different things, and there are different risks associated?
Yeah, so there's different opportunities with each of the different funds we have. And what I might even do is just give a couple of kind of different, say, examples of different projects that would have been on different funds and how they would have operated and the opportunities that they've gotten because of those. So as I was saying, with WhatWorks and with Digital Solutions Fund last year, it was a 1 year fund, so it was always going to be very intense. So we did try and, like we set out criteria for each of the funds that we bring projects on with. One of the advantageous criteria that we had for digital solutions was collaborative projects that were already in development. And one that came on and was a great success was the POTS program. So it was a collaborative project between Dyspraxia, DCD Ireland, and University of Limerick's Occupational Therapy Department. So it was developing online therapeutic services for people with dyspraxia. That was a phenomenal success because the project was there. I suppose it was riskier in the sense that it was only going to be 1 year that we could work with them, but like they did phenomenal stuff. When we're working across bigger, say 3-year funds, we have like much more opportunity, and the risk is less from our side in terms of like the amount of support that we can provide to an organization. So I suppose we can take on earlier stage interventions or earlier stage projects. And what we can also do then is we have the opportunity to link them and give more time ourselves to kind of link them with other potential partnerships. One that comes to mind off of that is off the Children and Youth Mental Health Fund, which I worked on over the past few years. There was an organisation which was developing a young person's bereavement support program. And it was really innovative for when it was starting. It was one of the first of its kind. There wasn't really an awful lot of data or understanding or research done within Ireland at the time on it. But what had been done was the Danish Cancer Society had done a very similar project in Denmark. So one of our consultants, we were able to link up this project with not just an organisation that we were funding, but with an international program that we could link them with and develop that. And coming off, like we've funds that have seen their course. We're now at the point where like our education fund finished up in 2020. Our youth education and our children and youth education funds are currently closing up this year. So what we're doing with those projects to ensure that they, like that they're not all coming off. These are projects off of 3 different funds. We're developing a community of practice for them going forward, where we're keeping them together. We're keeping the learnings going. We're sharing a space. And these are organizations that range from university level projects, like national education programs, down to smaller 2-person teams that are working, say, in a specific area of Limerick City on an educational program. So what we try and do is to link up, like there's various different projects, there's very different sizes of organizations and projects, but there's loads of opportunity for each of those to learn from each other. And what we try and do then is make sure that we're facilitating that space, that we're sharing learning, that we're not overlapping, and that we're making stronger impact then because of it.
It's all fascinating, and I've seen you guys described as kind of like the Enterprise Ireland for social impact. But one of the things I often see is a critique that Ireland is behind where other European cities are at in terms of government and governmental agencies collaborating, partnering with private industry, with organisations such as yours. Where do you think we are at, like when you look globally or even across to Europe, in terms of that whole model that you're trying to build and obviously getting traction and more projects, which is wonderful. But do you think we've a long way to go to really compete with where other European countries are at in this whole area of social impact funding?
Yeah, so I definitely think that we've made massive leaps and bounds over the last few years with it, and I think we're in quite a strong position going forward. So Rethink at the moment we're involved in what's the FUSE project, which is looking at social innovation and impact funding across across Europe. So like we're partnered with an organization, a similar venture philanthropy organization in Portugal, Malta, Bulgaria, and we're looking at the stages of where each organization are. And like I have to say, like, the outlook for Ireland is really encouraging. It's really, from our side, even opening funds there recently, we've started opening up, like step up funds, which are for these are sorry, not even step up, but startup funds, where we're looking at, like this is bringing, like thought and organizations or projects that are still at idea stage. And there is quite an appetite for funding with it, probably more so at the moment from, say, from private funding or from corporate funding. But as we've seen, like with the likes of the Department of Children, so for DCE DIY, with the What Works initiative, is that there is definitely a shift towards looking at newer models of creating impact, looking at for those innovative projects, and also, like accepting that we have to have risk as well with it. And that's one of our big things. So like, as I was saying, like the more time that we have, with an organisation, the earlier we can intervene with them. And I think that's one of our big things that we're trying to get across with other funders, is that we have to accept that if we want to create change, if we want to be innovative, if we want to look for these new models of doing things, we have to accept that risk is part and package of that parcel. We can't just be expecting, the top of the class that's already been there. Yes, we can continue to support, but if we're looking for those new innovations, we have to accept the risk is all a part of it.
Yeah, and accept that you have to have experimentation, and back to the old mantras of, fail fast but fail cheaply, and then make sure you learn the lessons from it. I want to ask the question I'm sure you get several times a day as a fund manager, but I'm sure many in our audience probably feel like they're professional grant writers and, pitching for funding. And, that's really, really hard, because you can have like a pipeline of 100 people you're pitching for funding, maybe 10 answer your email, and you might be lucky to get 1 in 10 then to actually fund you, but you started with 100. Like, it's so hard and competitive. Like, have you seen any patterns of what makes a great pitch, what makes a great application for funding, in terms of maybe some of the do's and don'ts?
Yeah, perfect. And it is, it's sorry, I was having a sup of water there to keep me going on. It's tough from our side as well, because obviously, we're limited by the size of our funds, and that with it, like, we get an awful lot of organizations coming to us. And one thing that we do try and do is, if we do get unsuccessful applications, we do try and link them or give them feedback to where they can go better. I suppose, look, when you're approaching, especially with Rethink Ireland, I suppose the one thing that we would expect is that you're absolutely open and honest with us. And that's, say, more for when we're bringing projects onto the funds, is like, we want to get down into the mud with you. We want to see what are the issues, what are the challenges, what are the barriers and the blockers that you're facing. Or, funders understand that there's no project that ever runs absolutely 100% perfect. There's always going to be some bit of a stumbling block. Be open and be honest about that. And funders are willing, if they're investing within you, they're willing to get down and support with it as well. But from our side, in terms of your pitches, it's really showcasing to us what is your impact. And it's not just in terms of, the figures that you're coming out with, that you're increasing year by year, the number of students that you're putting through, say, an education program, for an example. What we love to see is the outcomes focused, that deep impact, as you were saying there, Anya. It's, what are the changes for young people? It could be a smaller project, it could be a smaller cohort, but if you're able to show, say, for 10 people or for 10 young people, what is the exact outcome? What is the change? What is the potential, for replicating this nationally? And these are outcomes that we can bring forward. That for us is just as interesting as, say, like, coming to us and saying, well, we can funnel out 600 young people through this education program per year, but without actually having that outcomes, that impact thinking involved with it. Another thing for us as well is, showing, if you're coming to us, are you showing an innovation? How are you taking an issue or a program and showing how you're looking at it from a different model, a different lens? Is there other international projects or thinking that you're able to bring with it? And also as well, because because we're trying to put organizations in touch with others, and we're trying to network and build, social impact within Ireland, have some bit of a thought as well around the scaling of your project. Okay, this is where it is now, but you don't need a full scaling strategy or a plan in place with it. But having that thought of, like, look, this is what we're doing, this is the impact that we're making, this is how we feel that it can be rolled out, it can be adopted, it can be replicated, it can be shared with other organizations as well. Being open to collaborate, being open to learning with us is a big thing. Okay. And one thing actually as well, just even to bring back to Eileen's point as well, one thing that we do love to see as well is, like Eileen mentioned, that the projects are developed with the needs of the participants in mind, and that is huge for us. It's that beneficiary voice, it's that stakeholder engagement as well within your projects, to show that, look, this is developed with a specific reason, because we know that it's needed within the community or within the group that we're working with.
That's great. Thank you, Padraig. Everyone, keep your questions coming in. We've about 10 minutes. Just go to the Q&A function. Comments, welcome. Feedback, welcome. But we'd love your questions. We have one question in, Eileen. It's for you, from Mark. And It's building on where we kind of had started to land out, which was, have you done follow-up research on how children settled into preschool after the families have completed the programme? So your point earlier about you can see that they're settling in quicker. Has there been anything that then builds on the journey that you can kind of see, yeah, it has the long tail effect?
No, I think to date what we have done is we followed up with preschools who took on children who had attended Hill Street Family Resource Centre's preparation for preschool. And that was through the research with DCU, and they fed into that research saying that they saw that there were benefits for children. We haven't had the longer term look at children going into primary school from preschool, but I think it's something that, again, with capacity and
funding,
resources. Actually, Padraig, could I have your telephone number, please?
Yeah, I think Padraig will be in demand after this. All right. So yeah, that would be another body of research, but would be fascinating. One of the things I also wanted to ask you, Eileen, earlier, like it feels like you've got something proven here, incredibly impactful. You've got the evidence, you've got the data to back it up. And to Padraig's point there about, like, you want to look at something then that, you know, is solving for problems but has the potential for scale. Like, is this something that you can see could and should scale through other communities across Ireland?
I think the RTE Toy Show funding appeal has given us the money to scale the programme up. I think, Padraig, what we were probably missing was the support, because again, we're very small. This is the first programme we've developed, and that scale up, do you know what I mean? We can only read about scale up, but we actually have no experience in scale up. So as you said, also pilot projects, you know, there's risk and there's failings, and we've had our failings already in the couple of months. But that learning or that support would have really helped us from a funder to guide us through a process of scale up. So being linked with somebody else who'd scaled up a programme, but we need resources in order to have staff to do that. So this is part of my everyday work, but I already have my work to do, and we don't get additional staffing resources. So I think there's a lot of learning that could be exchanged.
And this might be a question we come back to, Niamh, for you as well, because I think as yours proves, concept is how you scale. But maybe, Padraig, just to you first, of like, you come in at different points of organisations' journeys. You know, you're going to, as you talked about, people who out with an idea, and you're trying to kind of find a way for them to experiment, see, does it work, does it get traction? But then there's projects like Eileen's that are up, they're proven, they're tested, but like might not have the resources, the bandwidth, capacity to really have that fast, rapid fire impact in so many places quickly. Like, what is it that Rethink Ireland can do in cases like that? And what have you, like, if you were Eileen, you have the funding, but it's a capacity question now. What would you advise? Because I'm sure lots of organisations and people listening in today have hit this point of inflection of, oh God, how do we do scale and growth?
Yeah, I suppose, like, look, there's two ways of looking at it on you. From our side, you know, like, we're providing that hand holding and that support to organisations. So, like, you know, and we've had it, like, you know, there's plenty of organisations that have come on and they have had to balance up the capacity issues as well with it. So, like, we take that on board, we take that into account. We, as a funding organisation, are not prescriptive in saying that, like, look, you know, we're willing to adapt to an organisation's needs based on where they are, because we can't treat, as I was saying, like, you know, we're developing organisations that are 2-person teams up to university level programmes. There's very different levels of capacity for each of them, so we are not prescriptive in the way that we're providing support. What I would say is, like, if you're engaged with funders and if you have a good relationship with it, and if there is a capacity issue, you know, like in terms of if it's reporting or if it's engagement, let your funder know, you know, like, be open, be honest as well with it. I've had these conversations with projects that we've worked with where, you know, like, we've had to re-look at the way that we support and the way that we report and the way that we touch base with them, because we, you know, and I suppose even in terms of phrasing, like, I'd always phrase to organizations that we work with that we see ourselves as supporters, not just as funders. I'm there to support a project to create deeper impact. I'm there to try and support them if they can scale. If there's issues that we're facing, and again, it's about being open and being honest with them. If there's issues that you're facing, let your funder know, because they're supporting you already. And the last thing that they want to be doing is inhibiting with it. And if you can go to them and honestly say, look, we're trying to reach out further to group X, Y, and Z, but we're bogged down with this like there's always conversations that can be had, and if a funder is honest about wanting to support an organization, they will listen and they will take that on board with it. Like that's one of our key things, is that we're there to support, not just to fund.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Padraig. Niamh, building on two key trends there emerging, which is one around impact and outcomes, and for you with the project, as you have mapped it all out, what is the intended, the hoped for outcomes with it? That's one. And two, is just that question of scale. Like, is that the hope and intention here as well, that if you can prove concept here, then hopefully you have a playbook for other organisations?
Yeah, it's a great point, because sooner get funding and you're beginning to flesh out a project, and you're like sustainability, scalability, sustainability, and that's where my head went like a month into it. So certainly the overall message obviously is to empower young people to go about better decision making when it comes to their relationships. We will work with a number of schools initially. Obviously we'll get feedback, we'll assess it, we'll get young people's feedback, we'll get teachers' feedback. But also we're conscious that the Department of Justice are also looking at this, probably with the Department of Children as well. So we'd really be hoping that something from all the work from Manuela through to Consent Ed, and this is kind of a very live example, but where those existing programmes just focused on Consent Ed, we also have the whole sexual health part, SATU, so it's much more than just the consent piece. And it all goes back to, I suppose, the healthy relationships piece, and what a healthy relationships looks like, and what young people look out for. We see so much coercive control and different cases that's coming to light in the media now, so that's really making young people aware, and that's what some of our local services would say. So certainly, look, that's the beauty of it too, and I think sometimes if you sit and go, oh God, where is it going to go? You could sit forever thinking about that. You just have to work with the bit of money you have. That's the sector we're in, and just, we know where we really want to go with this, but it's just kind of wait and see what avenues of funding open to us, really.
Is it hard to measure impact because you're in preventative mode? I often even think, even in my own role, some of the work that my teams have to do, it's the fires that never burned. That was what they were there to do, is to make sure that fire actually never happened. That's a very hard, intangible thing to then paint a picture of. We made sure that never happened. Is that going to be one of the hard things here for you, to actually measure impact? And how do you think you might go about that in time? Sure.
And, this is, how do we quantify all this work? It really, really is an ongoing struggle with all of us. And then when it's the Porricks of this world are looking for the applications, and it's lovely to hear the outcomes piece. So just when you were talking about the outcomes and the impact, I was speaking to one school teacher, and we were talking about the programme in secondary school, and she said, Niamh, if my boys just know where the local sexual health clinic is, that they can go, that stigma is not there, and they're happy to arrive. Obviously we've SH24 now, which is a brilliant service. It's fantastic, and the response to that in the local service is really, really good. So she said that would be a huge result for her. So I'm just taking that as one impact. It's an outcome maybe that, like Porrick mentioned, it's not the throughput of we did 600 students, no big deal. It's just empowering young people so that hopefully the DPSU, what they're seeing mightn't be as difficult as what's coming through all the different services at the moment. So it is a tricky one, but we have to just keep trying and keep, as Kevin and I were talking earlier, keep doing more work upstream.
Kevin, I imagine that really resonates with you, and I imagine it must be hard sometimes, given all of the work you talked about earlier in domestic violence and supporting parents when it comes to child violence on parents. But how do you do that, and attract the resources and the increased budget and keep morale high with your teams?
Yeah, and I think in the years I've worked in, mainly in the statutory sector, there's cyclical times where preventative work and early intervention is funded, and then there's a crisis, and I was a community worker, and then you get drawn back into casework, and that seems to be cyclical, unfortunately, and you spend another decade trying to build it back up again. we were talking earlier about this metaphor of children in a river, and what child protection and welfare are doing is trying to get those children out of the river, and what prevention is doing is upstream, trying to stop them fall in. And I can understand as a social work manager when there's a crisis, you're very tempted to bring those people from upstream to come down and help pull children out. But if you do that, you're actually making things worse. You're not preventing those children falling in. And the only thing I can think of, I know Effian Williams was on Monday, I remember him talking about the fact that one of the things you can do is if you use evidence-based programs, you know by that evidence that they're going to work. You don't have to prove they work if you use that evidence base. So you don't have to keep counting and proving and showing that prevention works. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, that as long as you're using things that you know that work, then you can show that those outcomes, I suppose.
It's a good analogy. It speaks to just the balance that we've been trying to kind of talk to all week. Before we go, I'd like to ask each of you just to take 30 seconds each, because we're closing out the What Works Festival of Learning now. And just, is there one call to action, one mantra, words of wisdom, or just something you want to put out into the world for our audience as your final word? Maybe to you first, Niamh.
Okay,
No pressure.
This is very brief, Anya. I would just like to say on behalf of the whole sector, less funding applications, bigger budgets, because the sector knows what works.
Oh, very good. Look at that. What works? Thank you. Kevin?
Oh God, I don't know what to pick. I suppose in listening today, and I hadn't thought about this before when I was listening this morning, but multi-annual budgets, even for TUSLA, we have recurring funding, but we don't technically have multi-annual budgets to be able to plan and prepare. And particularly for the community voluntary sector, it can be lots of once-off funding. It needs to be more joined up, I think, and it needs to be more bottom-up. I think there's a lot of top-down criteria that you have to try and fit into, rather than being responsive to local emerging need.
Okay, well said. And Eileen?
My heart is pounding here. Okay, first Dito, so I think I'm going to add those two into mine.
Good.
But I think more interdepartmental work. I think in domestic violence, we have a family who are currently, they got into a centre, then now they're in homeless accommodation. DCC needs to get a house for them. I think we need more interdepartmental work to ensure that we have better outcomes for families. I think the longer term funding is huge, and I think more homegrown programmes, because I think as Effian said, the evidence is there. But unless we invest in Irish programmes and grow them, we won't have the evidence, and we'd be bringing in the Triple P and the other programmes from externally. Yeah.
Well said. Very good. Thank you,
you.
Eileen. And to you, Padraig?
Perfect. Cheers, Anya, to round off then. I'm obviously coming from the other side of the fence. So yeah, like, look, as I've said, you know, like, especially with Rethink, but for any project that's working with a supporting funder, be open, be honest, come to them with what your issues and what your challenges are, and be, you know, like, be open and honest then to collaborate and to learn from it. And don't be afraid to take risks. Don't bridge that confidence gap if you feel that it's there. Come to us, talk to us, and we're happy to try and see what ways we can support or where we can signpost you to as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Padraig. And that's a wrap from us. Hopefully we set out to do what we said we do on Monday morning, which was kind of three-pronged. We hoped we would inspire many of you into action, that we would leave you with practical ideas and case studies and concepts. And we've talked a lot about this week the idea of a seamless state, and there seems to be lots of people who have gone off to noodle on that. And thirdly, and maybe most importantly, was to give you a real sense of connection to like-minded peers, people who are purpose-driven, that you would hear the conversations, hear the questions, and really just feel a renewed sense of purpose when it comes to each and everybody's individual and collective work. But it is the collective, it is the collaboration, it is the coordination that makes what everybody has been doing and talking about here this week so important and so impactful. So my thanks to you, our audience, for your attention, for your engagement, for your questions this week, to our speakers today, to Padraig Fitzgerald, Rethink Ireland, to Eileen Smith from the Hill Street Family Resource Centre, to Niamh Dowler of the Laois Offaly Children and Young People Services Committee, and Kevin Webster, Senior Manager Prevention Partnership and Family Support from TUSLA, to all of our speakers this week as we've gone through from prevention policy to today practice, our sincere sincere thanks and gratitude to our signers who've been here as well. Our thanks to Michael, Orla, Vanessa and Pauline, who's been signing for us today. We couldn't do it without them. All of this has been made possible, it's important to say, by the Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, who worked with the brilliant Centre for Effective Services to plan and organise these 3 events this week. That just leaves me to say that all of the recordings, the 2 events this week, are already up on the What Works Festival of Learning website. This 3rd event and 3rd recording will be available on that website shortly if you do want to share it with your colleagues. Thank you so much again for your attention and engagement. Have a great rest of day.